If you're an adult trying to learn jazz improvisation, andragogical theory tells us that the second half of the title may have piqued your interest. And if you're in a younger demographic, you may still be wondering the same thing. If you're new here, my name is Chase Sanborn and I'm a jazz trumpet player based in Toronto. In my last video, I took you through an exercise designed to attune your ears to the inner workings of a chordal structure. This one picks up where we left off, so you might want to watch that one first, and I'll link it up here and in the description. Using a backing track based on one single chord, we sounded out each note of a scale, arriving at 7 notes that seemed to fit most comfortably with the harmonic structure that we heard in the track. Here are those 7 notes and what it sounds like when I use them to improvise. I purposely didn't tell you what scale that was, although some of you may already know. We'll figure that out in this one, again using our ears as the first and most important step in acquiring and making sense of musical information. We're going to try to get beyond the question of what the scale is to get some insight into how a jazz improviser makes use of that knowledge, and then also the question of why you need to know this. I'm guessing that if I play a major scale, you'd be able to identify it as such. But what if I played a scale that might or might not be a major scale? Would you be able to accurately determine whether it is or it isn't? We're going to find out. Here's the scale again. Now, does that sound like a major scale to you? Probably it doesn't, and in fact, it isn't one. Every scale is defined by a specific pattern of intervals, and when we sounded out each note of this particular scale, we wound up with a pattern consisting of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. We chose the starting note by listening for one that seemed to stand out in the track. If we had chosen a different starting note, the step-by-step process would still produce the same 7 notes with the same intervallic space between them, but the overall pattern of intervals would be different. For example, if I start on the second note, the pattern becomes half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. We'll see if that one sounds like a major scale. So that doesn't sound like a major scale either. What if I start on the third note? Now remember, I'm not changing any notes, just choosing a different one to start on. Did that one sound like a major scale? And is there any question in your mind? Now, there could be, because although it's not actually a major scale, there's only one note that's out of place. Could you hear which one it was? Let's try it starting on the 4th note. Again, that's a scale that has only one note different than a major scale, but it occurs on a different scale degree than in the previous example. So far, none of the 4 scales are major scales, and because of the asymmetric pattern of intervals, no 2 are exactly the same kind of scale. Now this is going to remain true as we start on the remaining notes, so by deduction, we can say that if one of them is a major scale, it'll be the only one. Here it is starting on the 5th note. With this one, we're getting further away from the sound of a major scale. But let's pause for a second to consider what we're doing here. We're taking the 7 notes of a scale, and by starting on each of the 7 notes, we're creating 7 different scales that all contain the same notes. Now you may know that these are called modes. There's a lot of confusion about modes and what significance they have for a jazz improviser. The simplest definition is that a mode is a scale which contains the same notes as another scale. We could possibly compare it to modes of transportation, being different forms of the same thing. I'll talk a little bit more about modes in this video, but you can also watch these for more in-depth information. For now, returning to the scale, here it is starting on the 6th note. Again, this doesn't sound like a major scale. Now there's only one choice left, starting on the 7th note. Before I do that, if you feel like this video might possibly help you make sense of the incomprehensible, please give it a like right now. Thank you. Bingo! Starting on the 7th note produced a major scale. If we look at the pattern of intervals, we get whole step, half step, whole step, half step. You can start on any note, and that pattern will produce a major scale. Now, an important point here is that whatever happens in one key is the same in every key. One of the benefits of transposition is that it helps us see music as patterns rather than specific notes. Since every major scale represents a key, if you know the note that I started on, you'll know what key I'm playing in. Now, you might already know if you have perfect or relative pitch, and trumpet players might be able to tell by watching my valve combinations. The original note was G concert, and the notes that we sounded out are G, A, B flat, C, D, E, and F. These are the notes of an F major scale, which has a key signature of 1 flat, or B flat. For those like me who play a B flat instrument, the starting note was A, and the notes we sounded out were A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. These are the notes of a G major scale, which has 1 sharp, or F sharp. Because starting on the 7th note produced a major scale, that means that the original starting point was the 2nd note of a major scale. Now, as I just explained, starting a scale on a different note produces a mode of that scale. In every key, the major scale is called the 1st mode, and a scale starting on the 2nd note is called the 2nd mode, and so on. Each mode has a Greek name, and I bring that up somewhat reluctantly, because I think that contributes to the confusion. The 1st mode, the major scale, is called Ionian, although most people just call it a major scale. The 2nd mode is called Dorian. So the scale that we sounded out was G Dorian. Now, as for the other mode names, I'm going to leave them in the category of need to know. All you need to know right now is what you knew at the end of the last video, that the 7 notes we sounded out are the ones that most closely align with what we hear in the track. Now, this is more relevant than what scale it is, let alone what the Greeks named it. I say this because the improviser thinks of a scale as a pool of notes to choose from, rather than a line of notes to be played in sequence. That provides the framework for thinking in 2 dimensions. The vertical dimension relates to the harmonic structure, how the pool of notes relates to the chord. The horizontal dimension relates to how we use the notes to create a melodic line. I won't say that the scale is completely irrelevant, because the starting note implies an emphasis on certain notes within the scale. When we sounded them out, you could hear that not every note choice was as obvious as some of the others. Here I'm talking about chord tones and passing tones, and I'll get more into that as we go. But we could repurpose a phrase from George Orwell and say that all notes are equal, but some notes are more equal than others. So far, we've been dealing with a track that only has 1 chord. Most of the time, we're improvising on a chord progression, which we also call chord changes, as in when one chord changes to another. I'm going to take 1 step in that direction by switching to a track that uses just 2 chords. Jokingly, we could say that this makes it twice as hard. In reality, though, adjacent chords typically come from scales that have at least a majority of notes in common. That's what makes them flow naturally from one to the next. In this track, the 1st chord is the same as in the original track, so I'm working with the same 7 notes. The 2nd chord comes from a scale in which only 1 note is different. The other 6 notes are in common. The progression consists of 4 bars on each chord. Because 6 of the 7 notes are the same, even if you don't know about the note that changes, you stand a pretty good chance of playing one that works with the harmonic structure of the 2nd chord. I'll put that to the test by improvising using only the G Dorian scale. That means there will be 1 note in that scale that runs afoul on the 2nd chord, and I have to force myself not to go where my ear naturally takes me. See if you can hear the note that doesn't seem to fit. The note that my ear wanted to change was the 6th note of the G Dorian scale, which is E natural. In B flat pitch, it's F sharp. In the 2nd scale, that note wants to be lowered to E flat or F natural. I'll improvise something simple to make that change obvious. improvise some lines that don't put as much emphasis on this note, but they do incorporate the change. It's only one note out of 7, but it makes a big difference in navigating and communicating the changing harmonic landscape. The main takeaway is that the key to improvising on chord changes is, rather than thinking of a separate scale for each chord, you want to focus on the notes that change when one chord moves to the next. And most of the time, there won't be very many. On that topic, we haven't even yet talked about what chords we're hearing in these tracks, and there are 7 reasonable possibilities, although some are more equal than others. That's coming up in the next video, so make sure you're subscribed and let me know in the comments what you're thinking about.